പോളണ്ടിൽ എന്ത് സംഭവിച്ചു? പോളണ്ടിനെ പറ്റി നീ ഒരു അക്ഷരം മിണ്ടരുത്.
We're back with another episode, and this time a theme episode around the subject of parenting.
Yeah, and we chose the parenting, but as I was going through these movies, in some ways it ended up, that we chose movies that were about parenting, but about the role of parents and other adults in a kid's life. In my opinion, adults and parents have a big role in how kids, in the lens through which kids see the world. So we ended up kind of choosing movies that have mostly to do with how kids view the world, even though the theme is kind of parenthood.
But I think in broad terms, if we look at parenting as how children are raised from birth to young adulthood, how children are supported not only by parents but by other adults in a community, how children's physical, emotional, social, intellectual well-being is taken care of not only by their parents. I mean, it can be a really broad topic.
Yeah, it takes a village. Yeah, for sure. That's kind of what I came away with, like the group of movies we saw, is that it's basically about the adults who raise the children, who are basically parenting the children or raising the children in a big community.
Yeah, and I was looking at it from things as well from like parenting styles. So traditionally you're looking at things like authoritative parents, authoritarian parents, permissive parents, and uninvolved parents. And I think we see all of those stripes across the 4 films. So let's just list out the films that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, we are going to talk about Salt Mango Tree, Pappayude Swantham Appoos, Manjadikuru, and 101 Chodyangal, or 101 Chodyangal. You can say 101 Chodyangal.
101 questions.
Okay, 101 questions.
Which one would you like to start with?
Maybe we can start with the oldest one, Pappayude Swantham Appoos.
Okay, which is Papa's own Appoos. So we already have in the title this idea that this child is supposed to be precious to this father. Let me try and sum up briefly. It's about a father who has lost his wife. The father is Mammootty, and the dead wife is Shobana, which I think is a really good choice if you're going to have someone in this small role to represent someone very precious to both this father and son. She's there to make the impact, and she does. But she has passed away, and the son, Appu, is now in boarding school. His father is in business, and he's busy, and he's working, and he's an example of an absent parent if we're looking at parenting styles. And it's how the two of them really have to navigate the grief they're both feeling and the loss they're both feeling in this situation.
Yeah, I was thinking that of all of these movies, this felt like a very I felt like the crux of the story, that struggle of the child who's been left alone, felt very Western to me in some ways. It's one parent is gone, and the other parent is struggling to connect with the child. It's a very Western concept of recognizing the child's individuality and helping the child recognize his own sort of trauma and loss. And obviously then the movie later flips into like the dad realizing that the child might lose the child too, and we're trying to center that child in his life again. I do think the year it came out, 1992, is important because we're talking about liberalization in India, and the concept of that kind of childhood being that kind of very modern, possibly Western concept of childhood being introduced to India. And I mean, you know, it's not like Malayalis or Indians weren't exposed to the concept of, you know, the kind of childhood we think about now prior to liberalization, but this era of movies maybe struggling with or you know, kind of tackling that issue of a child as more than an extension of a parent, but as you know, an individual in their own right, and someone who is allowed to be troublesome because he has gone through a loss himself. So I thought that was interesting. And you know, I watched this movie as a very young child, and I didn't really recognize that. You know, I think the things I remember from childhood about this movie were Shobana, and I thought it was funny the things the kid was up to. So it's kind of funny to watch this movie through an adult's eyes now.
Well, and it is interesting that everyone seems kind of perplexed by his behavior, where I'm looking at it with that lens of course he's lived through this trauma. I mean, and we understand that Mammootty's father character was just as neglectful before the death of his wife, because she's, you know, there's a scene where she reminds him he needs to be home at 6 p.m. to take the baby to get vaccinated, and he completely forgets about it. So we know this is a pattern of behavior from before her loss, and it just makes the whole situation for the son, Appu, worse. Because at least, you know, prior to that, he had his mother who was devoted to him. I just found it interesting that everyone seems very perplexed at this, whereas today we would look at this child and say, well, of course he's acting out. Why would you expect? Because he shuffled off to boarding school, and then he comes home and there's only the servants to look after him, and his father forgets when he promises to take him to a movie, and you know, of course he's going to act out. That's, you know, expected behavior from a child who's being neglected, ignored. I mean, he's not physically neglected. He's being, you know, his physical needs are being taken care of, but certainly his emotional needs are not.
And, you know, Mammootty's character is, you know, I think, you know, Mammootty can have this image of being a very patriarchal kind of figure in Malayalam movies, like the head of a family, that type of thing. And to a certain extent, he is some of that, but he's also a fairly indulgent father. He's not a authoritarian father at all. He's not like kids should be seen and not heard type of father. He's just very casually neglectful. He's very you know, which is the reason why he hires a nanny for him is because he's very indulgent and he wants him to be entertained and amused, but he just doesn't want to deal with the deeper emotions the child might be feeling, and that is sort of at the crux of, you know, him coming to see the child for being a whole person who's gone through something traumatic.
Yeah, and like for me, this is kind of the other side of the coin from authoritarian. You're very indulgent, you're very permissive, but it's not recognizing that your child needs structure and has certain emotional needs that need some structure and boundaries around them as well.
And that only a parent can really fill that. Like it can't be supplemented by having servants.
Well, I mean, I suppose. Well, and the one servant is. I'm trying to figure out how to describe his behavior, because he's not instructing. He's just constantly telling Appu that what he's doing is wrong and that he's naughty. And it's like there's no. Yes, he needs those kind of boundaries to know when his behavior is unacceptable, but just telling him he's a bad, naughty kid for that is not giving him any idea of why he needs to behave.
For sure. I mean, that servant character is obviously there to be like the worst example of an older just like telling a kid he's bad, but not explaining why what he's doing is bad. And I think that character specifically comes from the kid should be seen and not heard mentality.
Yeah. Well, and it was fascinating to me too that when Apu is injured, it takes a long time for them to figure out how he ended up with his injury, because he ends up with a skull fracture. To be honest, at first I thought, oh, because there's a scene where Mammootty's character finally wallops the kid for something, and I think, is that going to be it? Is this going to be like, the terrible abuse at the hand of his own father? And then it turns out, no, it's not. It's, the moment they got involved with a scuffle with the nanny's brother, which, is hardly better, but it's still like your child was obviously hurt and you had no clue. Even to say, oh, you were thrown during this fight with the brother of the nanny, and are you okay?
It was a very convenient plot point. It didn't really make sense in terms of like what a parent would actually do if their child was like involved in a scuffle, or was hit in the middle of a scuffle. I mean, it is a very convenient plot point. And, coming back to that, like, nanny thing, it's another reason why this felt very Western to me, that this, like, the idea of, like, a nanny coming in and, like, bringing the family together is, like, a very common, like, Western plot point. And, we have that in Mary Poppins. We have this in a whole bunch of Disney movies that I watched growing up. So, yeah, it felt very, very... of that moment in time when we had these ideas coming into Indian and Malayalam cinema.
Well, there's also this little thing at the beginning which made me very uncomfortable. The nanny is supposed to be 16, and she turns out to be older. But there's this whole sexual thing going on with the nanny, which, again, that feels Western to me. I don't know. I mean, I guess that, anywhere that you have household servants or help of any kind, there's the risk of having someone in power in the household abusing that relationship. It doesn't happen here, but there's certainly, the nanny is right at the beginning is certainly seen as a temptation. Yeah. When she says at the beginning that she's 16, there's this like noise, like, I think that like suggests that like we are not supposed to believe her, and none of them believe her because they're looking at her and they're like, that's a grown woman. And like she's like there's like a focus on her body and like stuff like that, and like she like calls him, like she talks in this like very like seductive voice to him, to the father, and calls him like Papa, which, like, think about like a kid like a grown woman calling a grown man daddy in like that's like the equivalent of it. And I didn't know what to make of it. It like made me uncomfortable. I don't remember that part from when I was a kid. Okay, so the things you pick up on as an adult are so different. And I think, at 16, like the move, like when Suresh Gopi's character suggests, well, somebody around like 14, 16 would be good. I was like, who is, like, you want a 16-year-old to like raise your child? And like, I guess that kind of makes sense in India at that time, because technically you finish high school in 10th grade where you're 15. So like, technically you would be like 16 to take a job with a high school education in India, but the whole age dynamic like was a little wonky until they clarified that she's actually 22. Yeah, I know, but even at 22, she's still a bit young for Dad, but at least she's respectably.
Yeah, she's definitely an adult by the time she's getting to working with the kid.
Yeah, just in case anybody goes to watch the film, we understand this is a moment that is uncomfortable, but fortunately it never goes any further than that.
I mean, I do think the movie's a little bit aware in like the way they like kind of go bang, bang, bang when she says 16. It's like they're like, that's not what 16-year-olds look like. Yeah, it's a little bit self-aware, but also, it's playing on the sex appeal of the actress, who is not somebody I've seen before.
No, me either. And once again, it comes down to, Shobana in that small role makes much more of an impact.
Exactly. The only thing I remember from this movie before I watched it again is Shobana. I didn't even, I didn't even pick up on the fact that there was like a whole other woman involved in this movie. So yeah, this is a very of its age era movie. And actually, the one interesting point about this now in 2021 is that this is a Fazil movie, so both his kids, Fahad and
Yes.
make appearances in the movie.
Yeah, I actually shared a screen cap on Twitter because, Twitter has been all about Fafa. So I screen capped the Fahad, who is, I mean, you can tell who he is. It's very obvious which kid he is. And my Twitter comment was something like, "You can never get away from Fahad."
Yep, I just saw your comment right now. Yes. Especially what, that was a really funny scene. Only because all the kids and the adults came out to see what all the ruckus was.
Yeah, after Appu drops the glasses on the ground. I mean, and I could sympathize a lot with Appu. I mean, not that I would approve of, tossing the tray of glasses, but I can really sympathize with his frustration that leads to that, because Dad promised me the movie, and Dad forgot, and Dad threw a party, and I'm supposed to be, happy about this.
For me, the flashback, like the outfits and the furniture and everything was, if you're a child who was born around the time this movie came out, it's for me, it's so full of nostalgia. The music, the sodas that they're drinking. Anyway, I thought it was a nice walk down memory lane for me. Pappayude Swantham Appoos.
So that gives us one angle on parenting in films. Should we go to Salt Mango Tree next, where we have very involved parents? Or at least one very involved parent again.
Yeah, this is a classic helicopter parenting type situation. So this is basically about, Salt Mango Tree is about the highly competitive private education system in India, and Kerala specifically, where you're trying to get your kid into the best English medium, which means English instruction school that you can get into, and sort of the over-the-top requirements that these schools have for kids to get into them, and it's basically a rat race for parents. In the U.S., there is a certain element of that in certain classes. I see it most in upper middle class families where we, there's that sense of, I gotta get my kid the best chance they have to at least retain this class status in their adult grew up in. But in India, there's just so many more people, and there's so much more pressures. Everything that upper middle class parent in the United States might experience, it's probably 100 times worse in India, and it's throughout classes. It's anywhere from lower middle class to upper middle class that you're looking at parents. And I would say this family is solid middle class. They're not, I think the dad didn't go to an English medium school. Is that mentioned?
Yeah, he mentions several times about having gone to a Malayalam middle school, and he feels uncomfortable about that, as if there was something wrong with that. Like his education was not up to the standards needed.
Yeah, and I know that maybe since the 80s, it's a little bit more standard for Malayalis middle-class Malayalis to send their kids to English medium schools. And the fact that, this man who must be like, I don't know how old he's supposed to be, but we can assume like late 30s, early 40s, that he didn't have the benefit of an English medium education means that he probably grew up in he grew up in a rural area, but he also grew up in a less well-off family who couldn't afford a private English medium school. So there's a lot of class elements to this as well. And it's just about parents trying to do their best to give their kids a chance at life, but also maybe recognizing that kids need more than like the right school to get ahead in life.
Yeah, and I think that the film explores that really nicely because we have the teacher who runs the Shining Stars, which is apparently to help parents and children in this whole placement process. And for me, it was like this, as we learn later in the film, she was one of these helicopter mothers, and it took its toll on her own child, and she had to kind of shift her perspective. And I almost saw the academy or whatever it is that she runs as a support for the parents just as much as it is for the children, and a reminder for parents that yes, this system is important to you for your children's future, because you want a better future, but you can't forget how much else your child needs. And that is contrasted when they go to visit the grandparents, because the grandfather is all about taking him fishing and teaching him about fishing, and the grandmother tells him stories. And when at the end, when they finally go for the interview, the staff doing the interviews tell him to speak in Malayalam, and he tells the story his grandmother told him, and he does it in a way that's really animated. You can feel that he's made this really strong connection. So we get this message that yes, these things are important, but there are other things equally as important in your child's life.
And the parent who's super invested in getting the child into the most competitive English-speaking school is the mom, who's played by Lakshmi Priya Chandramouli, who's an actress we don't see that much in Malayalam. I think she's a Telugu actress, and this might be one of the few roles I've seen her in. She's very pretty, and she does the job competently. But obviously, Biju Menon playing the slightly boob dad is who grew up in a village and doesn't have as many big aspirations for his son, is obviously the star of the movie. He gets all the comedic bits. This movie is kind of heavily carried on his likability as a person, so I think he would come off as maybe just a kind of not a deadbeat dad, but somebody who isn't really focused on, like, an Indian father is highly focused in a lot of ways on his education. Maybe, that's what I've typically seen with my dad. Really wanted to get me into Montessori school, like nursery school when I was little. Like, for him, that was really important, because for him, he knew that was the way to get ahead, for me to get ahead in life. Dads do a lot of that in India, like getting kids into schools, working with that. But just because, dads have more freedom to navigate the outside world than moms do. So the fact that Biju Menon's character isn't interested in all of that, he's just kind of interested in getting by and keeping his family like in the place they are right now. Maybe for him that like he's already climbed from living in the village to a town, to a bigger city. So for him, he's already achieved what he wants in life, and he doesn't see like that he needs to do anything additional for his son. But his wife is much more the one who has aspirations for her son. And you see the struggle between what both parents want for their kid.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that the mom at times comes off looking a bit negative. She's the bad guy in the family, because she's so focused. And yet you can understand, because her motivation is to have the best for her child. And this is how she sees having the best. So much so that she kind of doesn't really look at her child as much as maybe she should, until she kind of gets the wake-up call at the academy.
I think a part of that is also because this movie stole so much from Biju Menon's characters. I feel that, she can come off as the shrewish wife who's helicopter parenting. But objectively speaking, he comes off, to me at least, he came off as sort of underachieving, and her as, feeling like she has to drag him along to achieve
I agree.
what their family could. And I didn't think she came off as negative. I just think she came off as like extremely anxious because she didn't have a partner who was who was like in this project as much with her as she wanted him to be.
Yeah, and that's true. And that's anything he does towards this is at her pushing as well. He's another father who forgets, oh, I should have done this. Oh, I meant to do this. Oh, yeah, you told me to do this. So yeah, and negative is probably not the right word, because what I was feeling was the pressure that was on her as well.
Yeah, it was a very like classic dynamic of where the wife is doing all the emotional like labor and project management of like getting the family and the kid, and the husband's just like, okay, I will do these small tasks as you tell me to do, but I'm not going to have a bigger vision of what our child's future is going to look like. And I think, I think the movie says that's okay, that everybody doesn't need to have like a BS stressed about the child's future as the mom is. And, she needs to take a step back, because clearly like it's not good for her and her family to feel that much pressure. This movie, I'm not sure how I feel about it, because the charm of this movie is so much to do with Biju Menon's character. I didn't think the ultimate message is obviously that a child needs more than just formal education, but I didn't feel as satisfied with I didn't feel like the child's point of view got hurt as much.
And he's a sweet kid.
He's a sweet kid.
He really is.
But he's a non-entity compared to like the struggle of the parents and their egos.
Yeah, I mean, I loved the moments when the film focused on him. But you're right, they were few and far between.
And so, despite what this movie says about a child needing more than just formal education, I feel like this movie didn't quite take the child's perspective into consideration. I would have liked to see. I mean, like we get, especially during the grandparents, is when we get to see the perspective of the child most.
But I could really connect with this film because I grew up in a family where my parents had elementary school education, and on my mother's side, my mother's Ukrainian, so there's always an emphasis on having professionals in the family. And I know that I'm going to say my uncles, they were my mother's cousins, but we call them uncles too because they're a certain age. So my three uncles were an accountant, a lawyer, and I can't remember the third. But, one of these, and the uncle who was a lawyer was really not suited to be a lawyer, and spent all his free time. He loved movies. He had a movie projector, and he bought his own film. So it would be a thrill to go over to his house to visit, because we'd get to watch movies. But I understand those kind of pressures to succeed, to become better. For my parents, they wanted us to go as far as we could in terms of education, so that we could have a better life and less of a struggle than they did. So on some level, I can really connect with this film, and that need to make sure that your children's future is better than yours, and how that can come out negatively despite all your good intentions.
I actually think in a lot of ways this is probably the most parenthood-centric movie. I like I mentioned at the beginning, that all these other movies have to do with really focusing on the child's perspective. This is the only movie where I was like, this is solely about parenthood and about the adults' anxieties and how they view the world. So I guess this is the most theme-based movie I would And, this movie came out among a bunch of other movies that had Biju Menon in these sort of lovable goof-type movies. And, there was Velimunga, there was a couple of others. And so I think this period of his career was also probably the best. So, he's still doing great movies, but, COVID and all, we haven't had a lot of releases from him recently. So if you're a Biju Menon completionist or even Biju Menon fan, this would definitely be a good movie to check out, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why I did, because I was a fan of him for a while. But you're right, it was this period when all of a sudden everyone was looking at his films, which was great because here is a really terrific actor who can bring a lot of things to a role. So that we need that in a post-COVID world too. We need more of him.
Yeah, I except for Arkariyam, I was thinking that we haven't had, when we're talking about Fahad Fasil especially, we haven't had this kind of lighthearted fare that much coming from the COVID era, just because it's been so Fahad Fasil focused and he likes darker roles. But I can completely imagine Fahad doing a role like this. He would be very good at it.
Yeah, we need that. We need that too. Well, I think I said last time I need more than thrillers and dark films right now, and I am hearing that a lot from people. I mean, it's great. It's great for Malayalam cinema that it managed to navigate COVID in a way that other cinemas didn't. And I think it'll be interesting to have 10 years from now to look back on this period and to see how Fahad focused it is. I think it'll be an interesting look back. So maybe that leads us next to something like 101 Questions.
Yep, which is probably the most critically acclaimed of the movies we have here. It's a very quiet, introspective little film about the main character, which is played by the child actor Minon. He got a national award for this movie. It's about a child who is sent a school assignment by his teacher, and he goes about sort of discovering life and the people around him. To be honest, not a lot happens in this movie.
No, it's set against the other plot, which is the father who has worked for a long time in this factory who ends up losing his job. So here we have a family that becomes, I don't know what their status would have been like while the father was working at his factory job, but they become poor very fast.
Yes, they're kind of lower middle class, it seems, and it's a very precarious, being lower middle class in any country is a very precarious position where you fall into poor quickly if you lose income. The
assignment, and again, we've got a bigger name actor here, Indrajith, playing the teacher who gives him the assignment. The teacher has been asked to write a book about 101 questions, and he assigns this to the child, and he offers to pay him a rupee per question. It ends up being very important to this child to be able to bring this money home because the family is really struggling.
Yeah, and I think the reason I remember watching this movie is because it was directed by Sidharth Shiva, and at that point we had only really known him as an actor. Well, I feel like he was an actor before he was he was an actor. Yeah, and I remember he kind of did these kind of side roles, gadfly roles and all those movies where you just need a cast of characters in a village, and I remember him from those movies, and it was interesting that he was a director and that he got so much critical acclaim for his first film, and he kind of, I feel like he's at this point he's had a pretty close working relationship with Lena, who I also find is a very interesting actor, and she plays Anil, the little boy's mother.
Yeah, and here again is a mother who's carrying all the stress and anxiety of this situation. She's not unlike the mother in Salt Mango Tree in some ways.
Yeah, I think because of the different class statuses and because of the different particular circumstances, this mother has very different concerns than mother in Salt Mango Tree, but we do have that common thread of, and in this she's much more, I get you're saying that in Salt Mango Tree that she can sometimes be antagonistic, but in this we as the audience are fully sympathetic to her and empathize with her because we see the ways in which she's struggling, and we see the ways in which the father is struggling as well with the loss of not just his job but also his identity and his class. because he wanted better working conditions.
Yeah, and the child's name, the other kids tease him about his name, and I have not written it down.
Anil Kumar Bukhara.
Yeah, and we learn in the film that he's been given his third name, Bukhara, is from the name of the factory that the father worked for, and the father's idea is that's my symbolic way of saying that I want him to own the factory. I don't want him to be a worker like me and be subject to the owners. I want him to be the owner. So again, we have parents who want more for their children and who understand that maybe their lives are hard, but it could be better.
Yeah, so I know that this is not a children's film. I can't imagine a child watching this and enjoying it the way I remember watching Pappayude Swantham Appoos and being entertained by it, or watching Salt Mango Tree and finding it funny. This is a very slow film. It's a very introspective and ruminating film, which is why it has space to ask all these questions. What do you think it has to say about parenthood?
I think for me, it's sometimes, as I've mentioned, on one level, parents want better for their children. That's true universally. All parents want the best for their child, even if they're helpless at times to secure their child's future. All parents have dreams and aspirations for their child. This father wants his child to be better than he is, to have a life that's better than his. The mother, I'm not sure. I mean, I think she's just worried about her children. She has the daughter who is ill, and she's constantly having to deal with that. I don't think she's as invested in her son at times, simply because she's so overwhelmed. Except when there's a problem with the school, and they don't have the money to provide a porridge at lunch for the children, and the teacher, played by Indrajith, knows that it's important for these kids to eat, and he encourages the students who can to bring an extra lunch packet with them so that the other children will have something to eat. And that becomes, because he says it right to the child, this becomes, I have to bring 2 packets, I have to bring 2 packets. And the mother, at first, she's like incredibly upset at this, but she provides a packet because we can see that she's listening to her child and she understands what's important to him, even if she can't always do it. I think these parents I found the father really interesting. Like, he seemed to really love his son and be tender with his son in a way that the mother wasn't. I mean, I think that's spoiler alert. I think that when the father dies at the end, that makes it even sadder. And the child himself, his final question is related to the death of his father. And he says to the teacher something, the subtitles were terrible, so I may be a little off, but he says to the teacher something like, my father liked me and I liked my father. And his final question, spoiler, is why am I not crying? Everyone says I should be crying. Why am I not crying?
Compared to maybe these other films, is what I came away with this film is that all parents can do is love their children. You can't protect them against what the world is going to throw at them, and you can't. And some parents are people too, and they are feeble too, and they can't control the world and what happens. And obviously money plays a huge role in that, obviously, but what the child is learning through asking these questions is the humanness of his own parents, and however much stress you take on, however much pain you go through, you just cannot end up protecting your child from the world, is what I got away from this movie.
Well, and I think that's also a perspective that as children we may not realize, but as adults we can look back at our parents and say, oh, yeah, I get it. And I think that maybe leads into Anjali Menon's film.
Yes, I think these 2 movies are interesting paired together because they are both so child-focused, from the child's perspective. Oh, I wanted to talk about one actor, Nishan Sagar, who I don't know if you've watched many movies with him, but I was wondering why we don't get more of him in Malayalam films. The first time I remember seeing him was in the movie Joker with that guy we don't talk about, and I just, he's so handsome.
He plays the father's friend, and the two of them are let go from the factory. They're the sacrificial lambs in the agreement to take back workers.
Yeah, and I really want to see more of him. From the 90s and the lead period, there were so many interesting actors who got small roles in the lead films who never made it big, because I think there was just this dominance of this one actor. And if you didn't have family connections like Prithviraj does, I think it was really hard for some of these more talented actors to break out. But if you watch Joker, he plays the villain character in that movie, and he does such a good job. So anybody who wants to check out something else with Nishant Sagaran, watch Joker.
And he was a good character too. I mean, it was this idea that, they were co-workers and they were friends, and they looked, I mean, more he looked out for his friend than the other way around. Well, no, that's not true either. When he's accused of being involved with some violence by the police, the other family sort of, I mean, they don't give up his whereabouts, and they make sure, I mean, that's looking out for him in some way too. So it's really nice to see those kind of connections.
Yeah, and I think his character in some ways has the strength that the father's character does not have. The father character has a tremendous amount of tenderness, but he maybe does not have the strength to hold up his family in this crisis in the way that maybe Nishant Sagar's character has. And I thought that was also interesting. That it's an interesting take on masculinity.
Well, and the father is very thin and very frail, and at one point he says, "Oh, I'll do, let me come and do this job," and his friend says, "Well, that's a little too physically hard for you, I think." Like, he is looking out for him. So yeah, you're right. We've got this dad who's emotionally very lovely, but physically, and doesn't tell his family that he's unwell and doesn't want to worry them. And now I'm going to cry.
Yeah, this movie ends up making you as an adult feel in some ways bad that adults can't protect children from everything, and that adults are frail in their own way. In a lot of ways, we have fathers in movies being sort of the ideal of a father is like this tree that protects and shelters his family, but this father is so incapable of that, but he is so full of love. I really like when we examine fatherhood in that way. I think we often make mothers martyrs, and we talk about the love of a mother, but it's always interesting to think about the love of a father. And that doesn't involve providing, and that doesn't involve being like the big strong man.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you mentioned it not being a film for children, and I agree with that, but it is a film that ends up on, here are films for kids, and I keep going, no. But it's, it's this lens of anything that has a child as a central character is a children's film.
If I thought this was a child, I'd have been so sad, and I would have cried and cried and cried. I would have been ready to, when it involves, when a movie has the parent dying off screen, it's fine, but when a movie has a parent on screen, I think it's too hard for children.
I know, and as soon as you see the crowd of people, I was like, no, I know what's going to happen here. I was already really upset. But yes, not for children.
Yeah, this is not a children's film. Even with the slight sexual tension between the father and the nanny in the first in Pappayude Swantham Appoos, it's still pretty fun for kids to watch. I remember not ever paying attention to the sexual tension, but to all the fun aspects of the movie.
Yeah, and I think for kids, some things that are beyond their ability to grasp and beyond their age, it does go over their head. I saw that as a teacher. Parents get very worked up about stuff in books, and I would say, if they can't handle it, they'll know. Or they'll skim over that and they'll take in the stuff, or they just won't, they'll drop the book. They just, we shelter kids far more than we should sometimes. I mean, that's not me saying we should just throw everything at kids. No. But kids do handle a lot of things in their own way.
Yeah, I mean, I think kids can want to, let's move on to the next film, because I think it's about, the kind of death the child can deal with in some ways, which is the death of like an older person. Manjadikuru, which is Anjali Menon's debut movie. There's some dispute about what actually the release date of this movie was. 2008 and 2012 are both listed, because I think the movie got a film festival release in 2008 maybe, and then got a wider release in 2012 after Ustad Hotel was a big hit, and people were curious about the first movie that she wrote and directed.
Yeah, and for me, I watched Kerala Cafe, which is the compilation of things, and I found her segment really compelling, and I went to seek her out. So I saw it earlier than Ustad Hotel, but I think you're right. I think that was the point where people went. And in some ways, this is kind of the warm-up film to Bangalore Days, because it touches on a lot of the same ideas from a different perspective and with younger versions of the cousins.
Yeah, it's actually, Manjadikuru is a more artsy film. Bangalore Days is such a commercial film, and that's very intentional. Manjadikuru was, I think she was right out of film school, or she was finishing up film school when this movie got funded and ready to be made, and I think it was self-produced. You can see in the credits there's a lot of non-Indian names, because I think she was using her contacts from film school to make this movie, while Bangalore Days is like very firmly embedded in the Malayalam film industry. Manjadikuru kind of stands apart from it a little bit.
Yeah, it's very much more art house festival circuit film, definitely.
Yeah.
And that's not a negative, but just in case people are seeking it out, know where it sits.
Yes, and because it's set in the 80s, is it set in the 70s or 80s?
Right up, I said the 80s. I was actually sort of thinking 70s, but then what do I know?
The fashion is 70s, but that's because like fashion got to India a decade later, before the internet and stuff. So so this film is about a Gulf-based family that comes back to Kerala for the funeral of a grandparent, and they bring their child, a little boy, along, and the story is narrated from the perspective of the little boy as an adult. It's in some ways this movie can feel very, we're watching this in 2021, but because it's set in the 80s, to me, it evokes a lot of the feelings of movies from that era as well. And I think that's very purposeful. Anjali Menon did say that she grew up with those movies from the 80s and 90s. And so that is what she's taking inspiration from.
Well, and there's this whole little thread, too, of the younger couple. Not quite a couple, but they're very flirty in the background. And it's very filmy. There's always a radio playing film music, and there's one scene where the camera pans and you see the man first, and it comes forward, and she's wearing like sunglasses and a headscarf, and it's very old style movie star-ish. So I agree with you. There's this little thread in there that is very distinctly a call to these old films.
And just the aesthetics of it as well, that, it's set in this old Taravada. There's the kolam, which is like the pond that's attached to the old ancestral home. Those are not things that we see necessarily too much of in new generation films. Whether you want to call this a new generation film, because technically it was made in 2007-ish, and it was only re-released in 2012. But these touchstones of Malayalam cinema these aesthetic touchstones are really prominent in this film because I think it's taking inspiration from movies of that era where it was very common.
Well, she did that in Bangalore Days too with Kutan. Like he was the character that represented that old aesthetic.
And I think she's kind of poking fun at herself as well with the Kutan character. As much as, she didn't grow up in Kerala, she grew up in the Gulf. But I think, just like me as a Gulf kid, we have a very romanticized idea of Kerala. So I think she's kind of poking fun at her own romanticized idea of Kerala through Kutan in Bangalore. And, it kind of makes sense if you see her older film, Manjadikuru, that like she's poking fun at herself and all these tropes of Kerala that she's very attached to.
And it's a film that deals sort of in the background with a very authoritarian parent style. We don't see Purtilikan. We don't see much of him in this film. Like for the first half hour or so, he's a corpse. We hear his voice at one point. The Vicky, the young boy, the Gulf boy, thinks he hears his grandfather's voice, and he sort of appears on screen with the grandmother at one point. But we get to understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is as much about caste, this family's caste. I'm starting to learn now. So this is a father who is very authoritarian and obviously estranged from his children in various ways. There are 2 boys and 4 girls, or 2 sons and 4 daughters. We see how this plays out with the children and their spouses as they stay. They come for the funeral, and the grandmother insists that the will be read after the 16-day period of formalities around the funeral. And it's clear that all of them are interested in the contents of the will for various reasons, and less interested in their ties to the family home, ties to their parents in many ways.
Yeah. When I say that, going back to the idea of caste, when I say Anjali Menon is poking fun at herself, I think she's poking fun at the idea of caste too, because these mementos of caste, this ancestral home, the pond, these are things that we prize in Malayalam movies or have been held up as things to value and idolize in Malayalam movies. But then, with the threat of the maid, the young girl who works for the family, we're getting this character that isn't often seen in this context in Malayalam movies. And suddenly she makes caste visible with that character.
Yeah, and we see it because of her connection to the young cousins. Because, she's 12, and on some level she's still a child, and the children treat her as a child, but all of the adults, they only see her as a servant. And you're right, a servant of a particular caste that, they generally mistreat her. It could be worse, but from the way they talk about her and the way she's accused of having, done something with the baby. I'm trying not to give too much away.
Everybody who is listening knows that there's going to be spoilers, so...
Yeah. But it's the children who are the ones who want to find a way to send her back home. And the children who, Vicky gives up his Kit Kat bars, and they find ways to earn the money to get her a bus ticket home. They're the ones, I'm assuming the adults believe she's just run away. She has, but she's had help from within the family. But she gets her revenge sort of in the end. One of my questions was when they do finally come down to the reading of the will, the children are all expecting something, and in the end the property is left to the grandmother, and stipulated that when she passes away, the youngest daughter would get it. So my understanding would be that would be unusual.
So if in a Nair family, which is also my family, and it depends on what region of Kerala you're from as well. I'm from Travancore. we have a very matrilineal system, so it's not unusual for the home to belong to the daughter, and like for the daughters to get more, because at least in Southern Travancore and Nair families, men marry out, men marry out of the family.
You see, this is why every time we bring up the idea of caste for a podcast episode, I go, I don't think I know it.
Yeah, so matrilineality is one of those things that I think Malayalam cinema struggles with a little bit, because in many parts of Kerala, in most parts of Kerala, in the communities that practiced matrilineality, which at a certain point in time was much of the Hindu population, much of the Savarna Hindu population, which means the non-Dalit Hindu population. I think in the early 20th century onwards, with the onset of the communist movement, as well as sort of westernization attempts, many of the families sort of reorganized to fit a more Western patrilineal form of kinship. And so, but you still see hints of that in Malayalam movies. You see the remnants of matrilineality in Malayalam movies, and especially in Malabar, where I think this movie is set. They have, I don't think they practice matrilineality as much, and so it only comes out in these very specific instances. Families are not, what I've heard, what I've read, and in my experience, children do still belong to their mother's families, but there's more of a tradition of a woman marrying in Malabar than there is in Travancore. In Travancore, where I'm from, men literally leave the family of origin and they live with their in-laws. That's how my uncles have lived all their lives. But I don't think it's that common in Malabar to do that. But when it comes to inheritances, I think women still get more in Nair families.
In the end, the younger daughter doesn't get the home, though. That would be very different.
Yes. Giving it to someone completely outside the family would be very different, yeah.
And it not only someone from outside the family. Let's completely spoil it. It's given to the servant girl.
Yes, because she's the one that the grandma loves the best, actually.
I wish there was a little more of that in the film. It, in a way, maybe I'm thinking it should be more like Nandanam, and maybe it shouldn't. About how the grandmother and the same actress playing the grandmother, being very connected to. Oh, and with Prithviraj as the grandson.
Yeah, I really think this movie, in the way it cast these characters, was literally taking tropes and making them real. Because Kaviyoor Ponnamma as a grandmother and Tilagan as a grandfather is literally in like hundreds and hundreds of movies, I feel. And all these characters, and Urvashi as the sister, there's Pravina. It's just so, like, these cast of characters are so common in these roles, and they've played these roles so often, and they've been together as an extended family so often that when we're dropped into this setting, it just feels so familiar to us.
So I guess my next question would be, what does it, particularly for someone like me, what is it revealing about parenting, parents, children, and families?
I think it reveals, to me at least, what I found interesting was that, okay, well, this has a happy ending because it's Anjali Menon, and I don't think she does sad endings. And I don't think that's how she prefers to make movies, and I really like that about her filmmaking. Like, I don't think she would want to have an ending like Nuta Mijodingo. The reason this has a happy ending is because of who the director is. But before we see the ending, what I took away from it is that childhood, to me, it seemed, is a privilege that these parents afforded to only a privileged few. And we see that in Pappayude Swantham Appoos too. Like, it's the emergence of the idea of childhood as a separate, unique part of an individual's life. In this movie, which is set in the 80s, so it's reflecting some of those ideas, is that a 12-year-old Dalit girl is not afforded a childhood because she has to work. And she's just a cog in the machine. And only the children recognize the fact that she's a child because they're afforded childhood and they're treated like children. So they expect other people to treat her like a child, and they don't understand why she has to work and she has to stop playing with them. So I thought that was the core point of this, that childhood is only afforded to a select few, or was in the 80s.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we do see some of that. I mean, even here in the West, if you come from a family that's poor and struggling, you're more likely, even if you finish high school, which you may not, you're more likely to go out and work. Your childhood might be different. You might have more of a childhood, but it will end sooner, or your adult responsibilities will hit sooner. I mean, I look at, again, my own parents, that's not a current generation, but it's a Western generation. And my parents were out working at 13, 14, 15, which makes you understand why they valued education and valued something better for their own children.
I would also say in the U.S. we have a lot of evidence to suggest, we're of unconscious biases and stuff, and that Black children are often considered to be adults at much, much earlier ages. We talk about Tamir Rice being threatening with his toy gun. It's because they didn't see him fundamentally as a child. And that is, there's a concept in America that the way Black Americans exist in this society is much more like caste than race. And I mean, not that those concepts are unrelated, but it's much more similar to the way the caste system exists in India. And so you can almost make direct parallels that not being able to see a child, someone of a young age as a child, makes them much more liable to exploitation, of not being afforded the protections of childhood, because we consider children a protected class in a lot of ways. And so when you take away the mantle of childhood from them, then it means that they are open to be exploited, they're open to being more likely to be abused, because their mind is not any more grown, but they have to exist out in the world.
There's our happy thought for the day. Said with much irony. No, but one of the things, I keep harping on is how those of us outside of a culture make connections into the culture, and these are the things we need to connect dots for people. That's like this. You can learn about that by watching this. Like this whole series of films has made me think about what childhood is, and like we came at it from parenting as a theme, but it's also what is childhood, and when are you afforded the those protections of childhood that we think children should have.
One of the things I recognize from watching these movies is also, for parents, education for the child is a way to sort of extend childhood and ensure that the next generation gets to also, their grandchildren get to extend their childhood as much as possible. Because the more successful you as a parent are, it means you can protect your child in a way that extends their childhood.
Yeah, I would agree. That sounds like a good place to wrap things up today, unless you have any other closing thoughts.
Yeah, I felt like this was very disjointed, partly because I was thinking about parenthood in all these movies, but a lot of these movies are also from the perspective of the child. So there's almost except for Salt Mango Tree, which was only from the perspective of the parent. So I was trying to decide what to center when I'm talking.
No, I think it. Maybe because I had sort of these ideas solidified in my head that I'd be looking at different types of parenting. I could see them in all the films, even if the film was from the perspective of the child. Children and parents, we cannot disconnect one from the other.
Yeah, of all of these, I think all of these movies would be fine for children to watch, except for Minon John and Chodyangal. Manjadikuru especially, I don't know if kids are going to pick up that element of caste that is very important in the in the story, which I think is what adults would pick up if they're sensitive enough to, I think.
Thanks for listening to the Poland in Empathy podcast.
If you like what you're hearing, remember to come back for our next episode and share our podcast with your friends.
If you'd like to connect with us, you can email us at polandinempathy@gmail.com or reach out to us on our Twitter feed @polandinempathy. See you next time.